Students to the Neuromotor Basis of Motor Control lecture. We will be splitting this lecture up into two pieces. In the first part, I will specifically be looking at identifying some of the structures of the neuromotor system that are involved in controlling voluntary movement, specifically brain areas, their structures, and then also the functions they play in motor control. In the second part of the lecture, so again, this recording will be split up in two parts. The second part of this lecture, we're going to look into what are ascending and descending pathways and what do they actually do. And we're specifically going to look at some observed effects of neuromuscular function or dysfunction, where we look at things like handedness, but also neurodegenerative disease. So first of all, what is the neuromotor system? Well, the neuromotor system is the entire system that is involved in the control of coordinated movements. And it involves components of the central nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, but also the musculoskeletal system, obviously. The focus of this lecture is going to be specifically on the central nervous system. And that is specifically the case because the central nervous system is involved in voluntary control of movement, while oftentimes the peripheral nervous system is involved in things like reflexes. So, what is the central nervous system? Well, the central nervous system is actually the command center of human behavior. Right? And it consists mainly of the brain and the spinal cord. And there are some components of that central nervous system that are directly involved in the voluntary control of movement. So the four components of the brain specifically that we are going to be talking about that are directly involved in the control of voluntary movement are the cerebrum, the diencephalon. Both of those are often referred to as the forebrain. We're going to talk about the brainstem and then finally the cerebellum. So let's start with the cerebrum. The cerebrum contains two halves. There's the left and the right hemisphere, and those are connected by the corpus callosum. So the corpus callosum allows our left and our right hemisphere of the cerebrum to communicate with each other. The cerebral is covered in cerebral cortex, and it consists of gray matter with ridges and grooves, and then white matter lies deeper within. Now, gray matter, the reason why gray matter is gray is because gray matter contains most of the neuronal cell bodies. You can find it in the cerebrum, in the cerebellum, and in the brainstem, and it's about 10% of the total brain volume. On the other hand, the white matter, which you can also find in the cerebrum and in the cerebellum, consists of myelinated axons mainly, right? And the color of white matter is white because of the fats that make up the myelin sheaths that are wrapped around the axons. More about nerve cells later, but now you know what the difference is between white matter and gray matter. So first of all, let's talk about the lobes. So there are four main lobes in the cerebrum, and each of these lobes has a very distinct function. For example, let's talk about the frontal lobe first. So the frontal lobe is very involved in emotional expression, problem solving, memory, and language. So it's basically referred to as the control panel of our personality and our ability to communicate. As you can see here, the frontal lobe is separated from the parietal lobe and it's separated from the temporal lobe. It's separated from the parietal lobe by a groove called the central sulcus, and from the temporal lobe by the lateral sulcus, which you can see on the top picture in bold lining. When we're talking about the frontal lobe, it's also very important to refer to the frontal cortex at the same time. And the frontal cortex in the bottom picture is actually the top layer of the frontal lobe, right? And it consists of the primary motor cortex and the premotor cortex, among other areas. But mainly for us, the primary motor cortex and the premotor cortex are important. The premotor cortex projects directly onto the spinal cord and is really important in planning movement. The primary motor cortex is also really important in planning movement, right? And you can see there also in this structure in the frontal lobe, you can see that central sulcus that separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. Now, interestingly, in that central sulcus, there is what's called a homunculus, right? And you might have heard of that before, but basically, you can draw a somatographic or a somatotypic representation of different body parts or the projection of different body parts on the primary motor cortex in this particular area where the top is relating to the feet and the toes, and as you move down on that central sulcus, the projection is more towards things like the lips and the mouth, etc. Now, let's refer to some of the other lobes. You can see here the parietal lobe, for example. The parietal lobe is really important in the integration of sensory information. So it has things like skin, temperature, and pain receptors, and those convey information that moves through the thalamus to the parietal lobe. Right, so if you are compressing a skin receptor in your finger because you are touching something, that information is fed through the thalamus and then ends up somewhere on the parietal lobe. So the parietal lobe really has an important function in the integration of sensory information, especially sensory information that comes from different sources. Yeah, so if you're touching something at the same time as you're tasting something, that information can be integrated together in the parietal lobe. Then we've got the temporal lobe, and the temporal lobe is really important in processing sensory information that's related to things like visual memory. It's also very important in things like declarative and long-term memory, and we'll see later on also quite important in the use and the integration of auditory information. Then finally, all the way posterior in the cerebrum is what's called the occipital lobe. And the occipital lobe is really our visual processing center, right? So it does everything, including visual spatial processing, the differentiation of colors, and the detection of movement or motion. Then finally, on the bottom figure, the frontal area is referred to as the motor cortex, while the sensory areas are just behind that central sulcus that we talked about before. And we talked about the projection of that homunculus, right? And in the sensory cortex, or sometimes referred to as the primary somatosensory cortex, we've got the visual cortex, which kind of falls over the occipital lobe. We've got the auditory cortex, which kind of falls over the temporal lobe. And what we do there in that sensory cortex is different information from different senses comes all together and can get made sense of. So that sensory cortex is really important, or is going to be really important for us as well. So just a short summary, because we spent a long time on this. There are 4 different lobes, distinct functions. There's one in particularly, we talked about the central sulcus, which distinguishes the frontal from the parietal lobe, and which also distinguishes the motor cortex from the sensory cortex. We talked about the motor cortex and its importance in planning movement, and we talked about the sensory cortex and its importance in integrating and using sensory information. Then inside the cerebrum, we've got a different structure, which is called the basal ganglia, and it's a subcortical component, which means it lies a bit deeper inside the cerebrum. It consists of 4 parts, which you can see here. We don't necessarily have to repeat all of them, but you will see later on in your labs that an important part of the cerebrum, and in this case the basal ganglia, is the substantia nigra, or black substance. And that substantia nigra is actually really important because later on you will see some of the mechanisms around Parkinson's disease, and the substantia nigra is important because researchers think that one of the mechanisms of Parkinson's disease is a lack of dopamine production, and that dopamine production usually happens in the substantia nigra. The entire basal ganglia are really important in the control of movement, and especially when we're talking about the control of force and the planning or initiation of movement. Then the diencephalon. Well, the diencephalon is really a relay station, and it relays sensory information between different brain regions. It also controls the autonomic function of the peripheral nervous system, and it has some role in endocrine regulation. There's two main structures that we can talk about in the diencephalon. There's the thalamus and the hypothalamus. So the thalamus is really that relay station, right? That integrates sensory neural inputs from the spinal cord and makes sure that they end up in the cortex. And then finally, we've got the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is more the endocrine regulator. Then the brainstem is the posterior part of the brain, so the back part of the brain, and is actually continuous with the spinal cord. So basically, the spinal cord ends up in that brainstem before it. We can use this word, but it's probably not the correct word to use, but before it attaches onto the brain. And the spinal cord has 4 different regions. It has the midbrain, the pons, the medulla oblongata, and the hindbrain. And basically, one of the functions of the brainstem is that it has the main motor and sensory nerve supply to the face and neck. That's the first thing. Secondly, it also has really important cardiac and respiratory functions. So it controls things like heart rate and breathing rate, which are often non-voluntary control. So that part of the function of the brainstem is often something we don't talk about that often in motor control. But what is really important is that the brainstem forms the connection between the spinal cord and the brain. Then finally, we are talking about the cerebellum, or the small brain. And the cerebellum is really important in motor control because what you get from the cerebellum is that it's really important in the coordination of action, especially actions that require really precise movements, and it's also really important in accurate timing. And the best way to think about or to remember what the cerebellum does is if you've had a few too many wines, or a few too many beers, what is usually affected is the function of the cerebellum. And you can all imagine yourself walking home at night, you've had a few too many beers or too many wines, or you've seen someone, if you don't drink yourself, if you don't drink alcohol, you've seen someone. It is very difficult to insert your key inside a keyhole when you've been drinking a bit too much, and that is because the function of the cerebellum is affected. You no longer have really precise control with accurate timing, which is required to insert a key in a keyhole. And then finally, the last part of the central nervous system, but which is not related to the brain, is the spinal cord. And the spinal cord is a long, thin, and tubular I'm not sure what to call that. So it's long, thin, and tubular. Wow, that was difficult. And it consists mainly of nerve tissue, right? So we can see here that it's mainly in the spinal cord, mainly gray matter, so that H-shaped central portion. And that contains the cell bodies of axons of neurons. There are dorsal and ventral horns. The dorsal horns are mainly involved in the information transmitting or sensory information transmitting, while the ventral horns are mainly motor neurons with axons that terminate in skeletal muscles. And then finally, connecting those sensory and motor neurons are interneurons. So I will stop the recording of the first part of this lecture here, and I thought that it would be useful to have this first section on brain structures separately so you can listen to it separately. There won't be many questions in exams, etc., around these brain structures, but there could be one or two. But usually they are really focused on which structures are involved in motor control